This is my 29-gallon Walstad Method aquarium and it's currently 5 months old. While it has eventually stabilised enough to add fish, shrimp and snails to the tank, I do still regard this build as a failure because the extra experiments that I tried made the whole process far tougher than it needed to be. In this video, I'll walk you through what went wrong and more importantly how you can avoid making the same mistakes that I made in your own Walstad Method aquarium. The first mistake that I made was starting this aquarium at the end of November, right before the winter months set in here in the United Kingdom. I wanted to see how a Walstad setup would cycle in cooler water temperatures, but the low temperatures ended up making this far harder than it needed to be. My fish room drops to around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, yet Diana Walstad does recommend keeping her tanks above 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit to keep the plants in the tank flourishing. In a completely filterless Walstad Method system like this one, rapid plant growth is essential as the fast-grown plants provide most of the filtration and keep the water parameters safe and stable for your fish. When I started this tank, my main focus was on whether the plants could merely survive the colder water temperatures rather than if they'd actually thrive in it. If an aquatic plant isn't putting out much new growth, requiring you to consistently trim it every month or two, then it's probably not doing much for natural water purification. If I could start over, I'd install a heater to this tank from day one and set it to at least 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit to give the plants the best shot possible. Now you can definitely cycle an unheated Walstad Method tank during the low temperatures, and I managed to do it with a second setup that I started about a month later. But that specific tank relied on Hygrophila polysperma, a plant species that I already knew performs well in cooler water temperatures as I had previous experience with it, and I really do think that made the difference. So moving on, and we get to the next mistake, which I think was overplanting the tank with species that I had no direct experience with. I've seen a lot of people recommend Hygrophila deformis, which has the common name water wisteria, for Walstad Method setups, and Diana Walstad herself highlights it in her book as one of the plants she recommends. But here in the United Kingdom, for whatever reason, Hygrophila deformis is surprisingly difficult to find, so I always ended up defaulting to easier to find species. This time though, I managed to track down both Hygrophila deformis and Hygrophila coriambosa because I was determined to give both of them a go. I did my homework and I knew that Hygrophila coriambosa would have been a gamble from the start due to its native habitats, and I accepted that, but Hygrophila deformis, on paper at least, should have coped with the tank's cooler water temperatures. The Royal Botanical Gardens lists Bangladesh as one of its native countries, and I knew from research in both honey and dwarf gouramis that winter temperatures can drop as low as 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which are colder than in my fish room. Looking back, it would have been wiser to start with just a stem or two of each of these new species and fill the rest of the tank with proven performers like Rotala rotundifolia and Hygrophila polysperma, as they have both done well in my lower temperature tanks consistently. As I mentioned earlier, both of the new species of plant are hard to source here in the United Kingdom, and the only vendor that I could find selling them back then sold them in their immersed forms, which complicates things even further. And that brings me on to my next big mistake, which is relying too heavily on immersed form plants. These plants need time to transition to their submerged aquatic form, and I suspect that the cooler water temperatures slows this process down significantly. While the plants were adjusting, they weren't really contributing much to natural water purification, leaving the duckweed in the tank to do all of the heavy lifting. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough, and the tank experienced ammonia spikes and cloudy water multiple times. Thankfully, I was able to consistently perform large water changes in the tank because of my Python water change system, which makes everything quick and easy, but even that wasn't able to keep up. For the first 6 weeks or so, ammonia levels would consistently climb back up above 0.5 ppm within 24 hours of each water change, and the stress proved too much for the plants that I added to the tank, and the majority of the Anubias and Bucephalandra melted away. Now this was really frustrating if I'm honest, because I'd had a lot of those plants for over a year and I'd had them in my previous betta fish tank and they were grown really well, so that is definitely an important lesson to take. In hindsight, this could have potentially been avoided with the use of species like Rotala rotundifolia and Hygrophila polysperma to compensate for the lack of initial filtration from transitioning the plants. In theory, a suitably sized hang-on-back filter or sponge filter may have been able to help, but one commonly overlooked thing is that beneficial bacteria grow considerably slower in cooler water setups like this one. So even with hindsight bias, I still think that consistently changing the water in the setup was the best route when starting this one out, just because of the water temperature being so low. Alternatively, I could have tried to prep the Hygrophila deformis and the Hygrophila coriumbosa by growing it in a plastic tub first to let it to convert into their submerged form before introducing them to the tank. But I do want to quickly point out that I recently added some new Hygrophila deformis to a heated endless live bearer tank and it's still having issues. As far as I can tell from its leaf shape, this one is already in its submerged form, but the stems keep melting away and I'm giving it one last chance before I'm just going to replace it with Limnophila sessiliflora. I know that a lot of people have success with Hygrophila deformis, but I don't know why. For whatever reason, in my water it's just such a problematic plant. So yeah, relying on so many emergent form plants that aren't actually in their aquatic form yet and offering any real benefit, and the cooler temperatures really did cause problems with this specific setup. Another mistake that I think I made in hindsight is not planting enough stem plants, especially for a typical Walstad Method setup like this. But to better explain why I made that choice, we need to look at the original goal for this tank. Before setting this up, I ran a poll on my community page asking what kind of tank I should create next. This particular setup was meant to be an apex predator tank featuring a paradise fish living alongside a variety of insects creating a food web. Because of that concept, I expected a relatively low bioload, so I assumed that a smaller number of stem plants would have been able to handle it. Personally, I still do think that could have been true long term, but the problem was that I didn't account for the initial ammonia spikes that naturally occurred during the cycling phase of a new Walstad tank. The limited number of aquatic form fast-grown plants just weren't enough to handle those spikes effectively in the setup. I know that I've mentioned this a few times now, but I really do think a lot of this could have been avoided by just adding more Rotala rotundifolia and Hygrophila polysperma from the start. They can do a lot of the heavy lifting to normalise the water parameters, even at water temperatures where beneficial bacteria might not be that effective, and on top of that, it's also relatively easy to remove them if needed later in the process once the cycle's complete. The final mistake that I think I made with this tank is the choice of shop that I used to source my fish. After deciding not to go ahead with the original apex predator setup, I pivoted and chose to stock the tank with zebra danios, since they're a hardy fish that should easily be able to handle a room temperature setup like this. But the issue is, zebra danios were added to the UK's controlled species list last year. While the fish are not outright banned, importing them now requires extra paperwork from the fish farms, and many of them haven't completed this paperwork, so they are unable to import zebra danios to the country. As a result, very few of my local aquatic shops have zebra danios available, at least back when I initially stocked the tank. The only place that I knew consistently had them was Pets at Home, which unfortunately doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to fit. So I initially picked up 8 zebra danios from Pets at Home, but within a week or two I was down to 2 remaining fish. Now, while the tank did have a lot of early issues, I was performing regular water changes and closely monitoring the water parameters before introducing any livestock. On top of that, I also added some yellow neocaridina shrimp to the tank on the same day, and they've experienced minimal losses, with the shrimp usually being less hardy than zebradanios. That's what's leading me to believe that the problem wasn't the tank's environment, but rather the condition of the danios when I purchased them. Since purchasing those fish, I have been informed that at least some pets at home shops here in the UK only quarantine new fish for 24 hours before putting them on sale, which isn't ideal. Ideally, I would have been able to purchase the fish from somewhere like Horizon Aquatics or Gateshead Guppies, but neither of them had zebradanios in stock at the time. On top of that, Kesgrave Tropicals, where I used to buy a lot of my fish online, unfortunately closed last year, and then eBay UK has actually went ahead and implemented the ban on selling livestock on the platform, reducing options even more. So yeah, in hindsight, if I could rewind time, I probably would have stocked the tank with something like Celestial Pearl Danios that are fine at this water temperature, and I could easily stock them from either Horizon Aquatics or Gateshead Guppies and increase the chances of getting healthy fish from the start. I want to quickly touch on the future of the tank as well, because I have decided to debuild it and repurpose this space for other projects in my fish room. Because of the ongoing supply issues with zebradanios, I'll be passing my remaining 2 fish onto one of my friends who has a dedicated breeding setup for the species. That way they can hopefully be added to a healthy breeding group and continue to contribute to the hobby in the future. I'm also going to be selling the aquarium and its light to one of my friends who's starting a new whiptail catfish project, which will free up some valuable space in my fish room. As I mentioned earlier, eBay UK has banned the sale of live animals, and my go-to shrimp vendor has already had all of their listings removed. They have since moved to Facebook, but as far as I'm aware, selling livestock on there goes against their platform's terms of service, so I think it's only a matter of time before they're banned from there too. So with that in mind, I plan to use this newly freed up space for some new shrimp breeding tank setups focused on maintaining the highest possible grade of shrimp I can. Hopefully, this will help me sidestep any future supply issues and stay more self-sufficient in the long run by having a ready available supply of high quality, high grade shrimp. Now, before wrapping up the video, I do quickly want to share some thoughts on cold water Walstad Method aquariums. Now, they can work well, but they are definitely more challenging than the typical heated setup, so I highly recommend you go the heated route if possible. As I mentioned earlier, this specific tank on screen now was started in December, meaning it had to do its full cycle through the coldest months of the year. Despite that, it actually had far fewer issues than the 29-gallon tank that I featured in this video, and it's been a lot smoother to do this specific tank. I honestly think that the key difference was choosing Hygrophila polysperma, as the main stem plant is it's a species that I've successfully kept in other unheated tanks multiple times, and it's proven itself to be very reliable. Now, this tank isn't perfect and it has still had some issues, and I'll be publishing a dedicated video on this one's setup in a couple of weeks' time. But the important thing is that it's had safe and stable water parameters for months now, and it hasn't had any major problems. I've been able to stock it with Medaka ricefish, yellow neocaridina shrimp and ram's horn snails without experiencing any ammonia or nitrite spikes either. I also have another unheated setup, which is my pearlweed jungle tank, which made it through the winter without any problems at all. However, the pearlweed jungle tank was originally set up and cycled during the summer months, so everything was well established before the temperatures started to drop. Looking ahead, I plan to either add heaters to any new tanks that I set up during the colder months of the year, or just set any unheated tanks up during the spring and summer months, so there's a lot more time for the tank to establish itself before the cold months set in. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope you'll be able to avoid the mistakes that I made in this tank and have a better success rate with your own Walstad Method aquariums. Thanks for watching and have a good day, and good luck with your Walstad tanks.